Picture this. You're a young woman in a medieval village, and the most dangerous day of your life has arrived. The contractions have started, but as the pain intensifies, you bite down on a leather strap until your teeth nearly crack. Your mother whispers urgently in your ear, "Whatever happens, you must not scream. You must not cry out, because if you do, if even a single sound of agony escapes your lips, you could face public humiliation, financial ruin, or worse." The church bells ring in the distance, and you realize that your silence isn't just about endurance, it's about survival in a world where a woman's pain was considered both inevitable and sinful. This was reality for countless women throughout medieval and early modern Europe, trapped in a system that viewed their most vulnerable moments as tests of moral character rather than natural human experiences. The sounds of childbirth weren't just discouraged, they were criminalized, punished, and used as evidence of spiritual weakness. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand why peasant women were expected to give birth in complete silence, we must first understand the twisted logic that created this expectation. Medieval society was built on a foundation of religious doctrine that viewed women's pain in childbirth not as a medical reality, but as divine punishment for original sin. According to church teachings, Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden had cursed all women to suffer in bringing forth children. This wasn't just theology, it was law, custom, and the basis for how society treated women during their most vulnerable moments. The biblical verse from Genesis became a weapon used against laboring women. "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." But medieval religious authorities went further, interpreting this divine decree to mean that any attempt to ease or express this sorrow was tantamount to defying God's will. If a woman cried out during labor, she was essentially rebelling against divine justice. If she sought comfort or pain relief, she was trying to circumvent God's punishment. And if she made noise that disturbed others, she was inflicting her sinful weakness on the community. This religious framework created a perfect storm of oppression that turned childbirth into a silent ordeal. Women were expected to endure what might be 20, 30, or even 40 hours of labor, without making a sound that might indicate their suffering. The reasoning was both cruel and circular. If you were truly righteous, you would accept God's punishment quietly. If you cried out, it proved you lacked faith and deserved additional punishment from earthly authorities. But the silence wasn't just about religious compliance, it was about social control. In medieval communities where everyone lived in close quarters, where privacy was a luxury few could afford, the sounds of a woman's labor could disrupt daily life for hours or even days. Neighbors complained to local authorities about the screaming that kept them awake or disturbed their work. Church officials worried that the sounds of female anguish might corrupt young people or remind the community of humanity's sinful nature. Village records from across medieval Europe reveal a consistent pattern of complaints lodged against women who failed to maintain proper silence during childbirth. In 1347, a woman named Margot the Weaver was fined 3 silver coins by the village court in northern France for disturbing the peace with ungodly cries during her travail. The fine represented nearly a month's wages for her family, pushing them deeper into the poverty that already defined their existence. Her crime wasn't theft, violence, or any action that harmed another person. It was making noise while her body tried to expel a human being. The enforcement mechanisms for this silence were both official and unofficial, creating a web of surveillance that surrounded every pregnant woman as her time approached. Village midwives, who should have been advocates for the laboring women, were often the primary enforcers of silence rules. These women, typically older and past their own childbearing years, had survived the system by conforming to its demands. They understood that their own reputations and livelihoods depended on maintaining order during deliveries. A midwife's reputation in medieval society was built on her ability to deliver babies with minimal disruption to the community. Those who allowed their patients to scream or cry out during labor found their services less in demand, their income reduced, and their social standing diminished. The economic pressure created a perverse incentive structure where the very people who should have comforted laboring women instead became their silencers. The methods used to ensure silence were as creative as they were cruel. Leather bits, similar to those used on horses, were commonly placed in women's mouths to prevent screaming. Thick cloth was stuffed between their teeth, sometimes causing choking or breathing difficulties during the most intense contractions. Some midwives used wooden sticks that women could bite down on, though these often splintered, causing additional injury to the mouth and throat. More insidious were the social pressures applied before labor even began. Throughout pregnancy, women were repeatedly reminded of their obligation to suffer silently. Female relatives would share stories of women who had maintained perfect quiet during even the most difficult deliveries, holding these silent sufferers up as models of virtue and strength. Conversely, they would whisper about women who had failed to control themselves, describing how their weakness had brought shame on their families and punishment from God. The psychological conditioning began in childhood, when young girls witnessed the births of siblings and neighbors. They learned early that female pain was something to be hidden, endured privately, and never acknowledged publicly. By the time they faced their own labors, the expectation of silence was so deeply ingrained that many women felt genuine shame about their natural responses to pain. Church sermons reinforced these messages, with priests regularly reminding congregations that women's suffering in childbirth was both deserved and beneficial for their souls. The more quietly a woman could endure her labor, the more she demonstrated her acceptance of God's will and her worthiness for salvation. Pain became a form of penance, and silence became proof of spiritual maturity. But the consequences of breaking silence extended far beyond immediate punishment. In many communities, women who cried out during labor were marked as spiritually weak, affecting their social standing for years afterward. Their children might face discrimination, being seen as the offspring of mothers who lacked proper faith. Their husbands could suffer professional consequences, as business partners and employers questioned the moral character of men who couldn't control their wives' behavior even during childbirth. The economic implications were often devastating for families already struggling with poverty. Fines for disturbing the peace during labor were calculated to be painful, but not impossible to pay, ensuring that the punishment would be felt but wouldn't completely destroy the family's ability to survive. Court records show fines typically ranging from the equivalent of 1 week to 1 month's wages for a laborer, depending on the severity and duration of the disturbance. These fines were often accompanied by additional penalties designed to reinforce the lesson and deter other women from similar failures. Public penance was common, requiring the offending woman to stand before the church congregation and confess her weakness, asking forgiveness for her inability to suffer silently as God intended. This public humiliation served multiple purposes. It reinforced community standards, provided entertainment for neighbors, and created lasting shame that would influence the woman's behavior in future pregnancies. Some villages maintained detailed records of women who had failed to maintain proper silence, creating a permanent mark against their character that could be referenced in future disputes or decisions about community standing. These records were sometimes consulted when marriages were being arranged for the women's daughters, as families sought to avoid allying themselves with bloodlines that had demonstrated spiritual weakness. The medical consequences of enforced silence were catastrophic, though rarely acknowledged by the authorities who created these rules. When women couldn't cry out, midwives and attendants had difficulty gauging the progress and complications of labor. The sounds a woman makes during childbirth aren't just expressions of pain. They're important medical indicators that help experienced birth attendants understand what's happening and when intervention might be necessary. Silent labors meant that dangerous complications could develop unnoticed until it was too late to intervene effectively. Prolonged labors that might have been shortened with position changes or other interventions continued for dangerous lengths of time because attendants couldn't hear the audio cues that typically guided their decisions. Women died quietly, their final moments as silent as their labors, while their families mourned not just the loss of life but the additional shame of having failed to maintain proper standards even in death. The practice of forced silence also prevented the natural pain management techniques that women's bodies had evolved to use during childbirth. The sounds women make during labor aren't random expressions of distress. They're part of a complex physiological response that helps manage pain and facilitate the birth process. By suppressing these natural responses, medieval society was actively interfering with biological processes that had developed over millions of years of human evolution. Village wise women and traditional healers, many of whom possessed genuine knowledge about childbirth and pain management, found their effectiveness severely limited by silence requirements. They couldn't teach women breathing techniques that involved vocalization, couldn't guide them through the natural rhythms of labor that depend partly on sound, and couldn't use the audio feedback that helps determine when and how to provide assistance. The isolation created by silence requirements compounded the medical dangers. When women couldn't call for help or indicate their needs through vocal communication, they became entirely dependent on the visual observations and assumptions of their attendants. In dark, cramped medieval dwellings where most births took place, visual monitoring was often inadequate to detect developing problems. Record keeping from medieval hospitals and religious institutions reveals patterns of maternal and infant mortality that correlate with the strictness of silence enforcement in different regions. Areas where church authorities were particularly zealous about maintaining quiet during childbirth show consistently higher rates of death and complications, though contemporary observers attributed these outcomes to God's will rather than human interference with natural processes. The silence requirements also prevented the formation of supportive networks among women that might have improved outcomes for everyone. When births were conducted in enforced quiet, there was no opportunity for women to share techniques, offer encouragement, or provide the emotional support that has been shown to improve both physical and psychological outcomes during labor. Instead of creating communities of mutual aid and shared knowledge, the silence rules fostered environments of fear, isolation, and competition. Women competed to demonstrate their superior virtue through their ability to suffer quietly, creating hierarchies based on pain tolerance rather than collaborative approaches to one of life's most challenging experiences. The psychological trauma inflicted by these practices extended far beyond the immediate experience of childbirth. Women who had been forced to labor in silence often developed lasting anxiety disorders, depression, and complex relationships with their own bodies and reproductive functions. The association between motherhood and silent suffering created patterns of emotional suppression that affected how these women related to their children, their spouses, and themselves for years afterward. Many women reported in confessional records and personal letters that they continued to feel shame about their natural responses to pain long after their children were born. They described feeling like failures as mothers and as Christians because they had struggled to maintain complete silence during what was supposed to be their defining moment as women. This internalized shame affected their confidence in their parenting abilities and their willingness to seek help during subsequent pregnancies. The children born into these silent environments also suffered consequences that medieval society never acknowledged. Babies whose mothers had been forced to suppress their natural responses during labor often showed signs of distress that weren't understood at the time. The stress hormones produced when women fight against their natural birthing responses cross the placental barrier, affecting fetal development and potentially influencing the child's later emotional and psychological development. Moreover, children who grew up in communities where female pain was systematically silenced and shamed developed distorted understanding of normal human responses to suffering. Boys learned that women's pain was both inevitable and somehow deserved, while girls internalized the expectation that their own future suffering should be hidden and endured without complaint or support. As we delve deeper into this dark chapter of history, we begin to see how the demand for silence during childbirth was just one manifestation of a broader system designed to control and diminish women's experiences. But the true horror lies not just in the practice itself, but in how thoroughly it was accepted, defended, and perpetuated by the very communities that should have protected their most vulnerable members. The enforcement of silence wasn't limited to the moment of birth itself. It began months before labor and extended long after delivery, creating a comprehensive system of control that governed every aspect of a woman's reproductive experience. During pregnancy, women were regularly reminded through sermons, gossip, and family instruction that their upcoming trial would test not just their physical endurance, but their moral worthiness. Village women who had successfully given birth in silence became unofficial enforcers, sharing their techniques and judging those who seemed unprepared for the challenge ahead. Pregnant women were taught specific methods for suppressing their natural responses to pain. They practiced breathing techniques designed not to ease suffering, but to prevent vocal expressions of it. They learned to bite their tongues, clench their fists until their nails drew blood, and redirect their agony inward rather than allowing it to escape through sound. These weren't medical interventions aimed at improving outcomes. They were training regimens for psychological endurance that often made the physical experience more dangerous and traumatic. The tools of silence became as essential to medieval childbirth as any medical equipment. Leather straps weren't just placed in women's mouths during active labor. They were prepared weeks in advance, sometimes blessed by local priests to sanctify the suffering they would help contain. Families would craft these implements with the same care they might devote to preparing a wedding dress or funeral shroud, understanding that their effectiveness could determine whether their daughter, wife, or sister faced additional punishment after her ordeal. Some communities developed elaborate rituals around the preparation for silent birth. Women would gather in circles to practice suppressing screams, treating it like a skill that could be perfected through repetition. They would pinch each other, pull hair, or inflict minor injuries while practicing maintaining facial composure and vocal silence. These sessions became grotesque parodies of female solidarity, where women taught each other to endure rather than supporting each other through difficulty. The midwives who presided over these silent births occupied an impossible position between their medical knowledge and social expectations. Many understood that the sounds women made during labor provided crucial information about the progress of delivery and the development of complications. They could hear in a woman's breathing patterns, groans, and involuntary vocalizations whether the baby was positioned correctly, whether the mother was experiencing normal labor pains or dangerous complications, and when the crucial moments of delivery were approaching. But this medical knowledge conflicted directly with their social obligations to maintain community standards. A midwife who allowed her patient to scream might deliver a healthy baby, but she would face professional ruin and social ostracism. Conversely, a midwife who successfully enforced silence might lose both mother and child to complications she could have detected and addressed if she had been permitted to listen to the natural sounds of labor. The most skilled midwives developed subtle techniques for gathering information without encouraging vocalization. They learned to read facial expressions, monitor breathing patterns, and detect physical signs of distress that didn't require auditory cues. But these visual and tactile methods were far less reliable than the comprehensive feedback that vocal responses provided, leading to delayed recognition of dangerous situations. Court records from various European regions reveal the impossible standards these medical practitioners faced. In 1389, a midwife named Agnes the Healer was brought before ecclesiastical court in Bavaria on charges of permitting ungodly disturbance during sacred travail. The specific accusation was that she had failed to adequately silence a woman whose labor lasted 3 days and 2 nights. Agnes defended herself by pointing out that both mother and child had survived what had clearly been a difficult and dangerous delivery, but the court was unmoved by medical outcomes when faced with evidence of disturbed peace. Agnes was fined heavily and required to swear an oath that she would never again allow such disturbances during deliveries under her care. 6 months later, she was called to attend another difficult birth. This time, she enforced complete silence as required by her oath. The mother died quietly, along with her unborn child, after a labor that might have been saved if Agnes had been permitted to respond to the vocal cues that could have guided her interventions. The economic pressures surrounding silent birth created a market for specialized equipment and services that profited from women's suffering. Craftsmen developed increasingly sophisticated gags and restraints, marketing them to families as investments in their daughters' spiritual development and social standing. These devices were often expensive, representing significant financial outlays for families already struggling with poverty, but they were considered essential purchases that no respectable household could do without. Churches began selling blessed items specifically designed to aid in silent suffering. Holy relics were embedded in leather bits, sanctified herbs were woven into gags, and prayers were inscribed on wooden implements designed to be bitten during contractions. These religious modifications didn't make the devices any more effective at their stated purpose, but they added spiritual significance that justified higher prices and made the suffering they enabled seem more acceptable to the families who purchased them. The marketplace for silent birth extended beyond physical implements to include services and consultation. Experienced women who had successfully delivered multiple children without making significant noise could earn income by teaching techniques to younger women. These informal schools of silent suffering operated in many communities, creating another layer of economic exploitation built on the systematic suppression of natural human responses to pain. Some entrepreneurial individuals developed patent medicines and herbal preparations that claimed to make silent birth easier to endure. These concoctions, often containing dangerous substances like mercury, lead, or toxic plant extracts, were marketed as aids to spiritual strength rather than medical treatments. They rarely provided any actual pain relief, but they sometimes caused numbness, confusion, or unconsciousness that made vocal responses impossible, achieving the desired silence through what amounted to poisoning. The social consequences of failing to maintain silence extended far beyond the immediate family to affect entire communities' reputations and relationships. Villages known for harboring women who couldn't control themselves during childbirth faced criticism from neighboring settlements and disapproval from religious authorities. This community-level shame created additional pressure for local enforcement of silence rules, as village leaders understood that their own standing could be affected by the behavior of their female residents. Marriage negotiations between families often included discussions about the vocal behavior of female relatives during previous births. Families with daughters known to have maintained exemplary silence could command higher bride prices and more advantageous matches. Conversely, families with a history of noisy births might find their daughters' marriage prospects significantly diminished, creating generational consequences for individual failures to suffer quietly. The record-keeping around these incidents reveals the bureaucratic apparatus that developed to monitor and control women's behavior during their most vulnerable moments. Parish registers didn't just record births, deaths, and marriages. They often included notations about the conduct of mothers during delivery. These records could follow women throughout their lives, affecting their access to certain religious ceremonies, their eligibility for community positions, and their family's social standing. Village courts developed standardized procedures for investigating complaints about noisy births. Neighbors were encouraged to report disturbances, and testimony was taken from multiple witnesses about the duration, volume, and character of sounds made during labor. These judicial proceedings treated natural human responses to extreme pain as criminal behavior, complete with evidence gathering, witness testimony, and formal verdicts that became part of permanent legal records. The punishments imposed for vocal violations during childbirth were carefully calibrated to cause maximum social and economic damage without completely destroying the family's ability to function. Repeat offenders faced escalating penalties, with some communities maintaining detailed records of each woman's history of vocal control during previous births. A woman who failed to maintain silence during multiple deliveries might find herself permanently marked as spiritually deficient, affecting not just her own standing but her children's future prospects. Public penance rituals became elaborate community events that served multiple social functions beyond simple punishment. These ceremonies reinforced behavioral expectations for all women, provided entertainment and moral instruction for the community, and created lasting psychological trauma for the individuals forced to participate. Women were required to confess their weakness publicly, describe how their failure to suffer silently had dishonored God and disturbed their neighbors, and promise to do better in future pregnancies. The psychological manipulation involved in these public confessions was sophisticated and cruel. Women were required to express gratitude for the punishment they received, to acknowledge that their suffering was both deserved and beneficial, and to encourage other women to learn from their failures. They had to participate actively in their own humiliation, demonstrating that they understood and accepted the logic of the system that had brutalized them. The long-term effects of these practices on community social structures were profound and lasting. Relationships between women became characterized by surveillance, competition, and mutual policing rather than support and solidarity. The natural bonds that might have formed between mothers sharing similar experiences were replaced by hierarchies based on demonstrated ability to suffer without complaint. Young women approaching their first pregnancies lived in constant anxiety about their ability to meet community expectations. They had witnessed the punishment of those who failed, heard the stories of women who had succeeded, and understood that their own worth would be measured largely by their capacity for silent endurance. This anticipatory fear often made their actual labor experiences more difficult and dangerous, as anxiety and terror interfered with the natural processes of childbirth. The medical knowledge that might have improved outcomes for mothers and babies was actively suppressed when it conflicted with silence requirements. Traditional remedies that involved vocalization, breathing techniques that required sound, and diagnostic methods that depended on auditory feedback were abandoned in favor of approaches that prioritized quiet over effectiveness. The accumulation of practical wisdom about childbirth, which had developed over generations of women's experiences, was deliberately fragmented and lost. As these practices became more entrenched over centuries, they created cultural patterns that extended far beyond childbirth itself. The expectation that women should suffer silently became embedded in social attitudes toward female pain in general, affecting how communities responded to illness, injury, and other forms of distress experienced by women. The normalization of ignoring women's expressions of pain during their most vulnerable moments established precedents that influenced medical care, legal protections, and social support systems for generations. The systematic suppression of women's voices during childbirth created ripple effects that extended into every aspect of medieval society's treatment of female experience. What began as religious doctrine about divine punishment evolved into a comprehensive system of social control that used women's most vulnerable moments as opportunities to reinforce their subordinate status. The silence demanded during labor wasn't just about maintaining community peace, it was about training women to accept that their pain, their needs, and their very existence were secondary to the comfort and convenience of others. The training for silent birth began almost from the moment a girl could walk. Young children were taught to observe and internalize the lessons of female suffering through carefully orchestrated exposure to the birthing process. When their mothers, sisters, or neighbors went into labor, girls as young as 5 or 6 were positioned where they could witness the proceedings without interfering. They watched as women bit down on leather straps until their teeth cracked, saw how they gripped wooden posts until their knuckles turned white, and learned that the most admirable response to excruciating pain was complete vocal restraint. These childhood lessons were reinforced through storytelling traditions that celebrated women who had achieved legendary status for their silent suffering. Village elders would recount tales of mothers who had delivered twins without making a sound, women who had labored for days in complete quiet, and heroic figures who had maintained their silence even while dying in childbirth. These stories weren't presented as tragedies of medical ignorance or social cruelty. They were offered as inspirational examples of feminine virtue and spiritual strength. The most insidious aspect of this conditioning was how it taught girls to view their own future suffering as a measure of their worth. They learned that a woman's value was determined not by her intelligence, skills, or contributions to her community, but by her ability to endure pain without burdening others with evidence of her distress. This created a psychological framework where women competed with each other in suffering rather than supporting each other through difficulty. Churches played a crucial role in reinforcing these messages through sermons specifically designed for women and girls. Priests would dedicate entire services to the topic of righteous suffering, using biblical examples and local success stories to emphasize that female pain was both inevitable and beneficial. They taught that crying out during labor was equivalent to blasphemy, that seeking comfort was a sign of weak faith, and that the women who suffered most quietly were closest to God's grace. The religious framework also provided theological justification for the most extreme enforcement measures. When women died from complications that might have been treatable if they had been allowed to communicate their distress, their deaths were interpreted as divine will rather than preventable tragedies. The silence that contributed to their demise was praised as evidence of their spiritual maturity, turning medical disasters into religious victories. Local authorities developed increasingly sophisticated methods for monitoring and enforcing silence requirements. Some communities appointed official birth monitors, usually older women past their childbearing years, whose job was to attend deliveries and report any violations of proper conduct. These monitors were given legal authority to assess fines on the spot, creating a system of immediate punishment that made resistance virtually impossible. The monitors developed detailed criteria for evaluating vocal transgressions during labor. They distinguished between different types of sounds, assigning varying levels of punishment based on volume, duration, and perceived intent. A brief gasp might result in a minor fine, while sustained crying could lead to major financial penalties and public penance. Some monitors kept detailed logs of each woman's performance during labor, creating permanent records that could be referenced in future pregnancies or used to assess family character during marriage negotiations. These enforcement systems created an atmosphere of constant surveillance around pregnant women that began months before their due dates. Neighbors were encouraged to report any evidence that an expecting mother might be inadequately prepared for silent birth. Women who expressed anxiety about their upcoming labor, who seemed physically weak, or who had previously failed to maintain proper quiet faced additional scrutiny and pressure from community authorities. The economic exploitation surrounding silent birth requirements created entire industries built on women's suffering. Skilled craftsmen specialized in creating increasingly elaborate restraint devices, marketing them as essential equipment for any respectable family. These implements ranged from simple leather bits to complex mechanisms with adjustable straps, padded surfaces, and religious decorations that supposedly enhanced their spiritual effectiveness. The most expensive devices incorporated precious metals and gems, allowing wealthy families to demonstrate their resources while ensuring their daughters' compliance with the social expectations. Poor families often went into debt to purchase adequate silencing equipment, understanding that the social consequences of inadequate preparation could be even more financially devastating than the initial expense. Medical practitioners found themselves caught between their understanding of effective treatment and the social demands for silence enforcement. Many midwives possessed genuine knowledge about pain management, positioning techniques, and interventions that could ease difficult labors, but these treatments often required vocal communication between patient and practitioner. When women couldn't cry out, midwives lost crucial information about the progress of labor and the development of complications. Some midwives attempted to work around silence requirements by developing subtle communication systems based on hand signals, facial expressions, and physical gestures. These alternative methods were less reliable than vocal communication, but they allowed some degree of interaction without violating community standards. However, even these workarounds were risky, as overly helpful midwives could face accusations of encouraging weakness or undermining divine will. The most tragic cases involved midwives who possessed knowledge that could have saved lives but were prevented from using it by silence requirements. Court records reveal instances where experienced practitioners knew exactly what interventions were needed but couldn't implement them, because doing so would have required allowing or encouraging vocal responses from their patients. These medical professionals face the agonizing choice between following their training and maintaining their social standing. The psychological impact on the midwives themselves was severe and lasting. Many developed what we might now recognize as moral injury from being forced to stand by, while preventable complications developed into life-threatening emergencies. They carried the knowledge that their expertise could have made a difference, but social constraints had prevented them from providing effective care. The children born under these conditions often showed signs of distress that weren't understood at the time, but make perfect sense in light of modern medical knowledge. When mothers are forced to suppress their natural responses during labor, stress hormones flood their systems and cross the placental barrier, affecting fetal development. Babies born after silent labors frequently exhibited signs of what medieval observers attributed to various supernatural or moral causes, but which were likely related to the traumatic circumstances of their births. These children grew up in communities where female pain was systematically ignored and delegitimized, creating lasting psychological patterns that affected how they understood relationships, empathy, and their own worth. Boys learned that women's suffering was both natural and unimportant, while girls internalized the expectation that their own future pain should be hidden and endured without seeking help or comfort. The intergenerational transmission of these attitudes created self-perpetuating cycles of trauma that lasted for centuries. Women who had been forced to labor in silence often became the most zealous enforcers of the same requirements for their daughters and neighbors, unable to acknowledge that their own suffering had been unnecessary and preventable. They had survived by convincing themselves that their pain had been meaningful and virtuous, making it psychologically impossible to recognize the system's cruelty without confronting their own victimization. Village records reveal patterns of escalating enforcement over time, as communities competed to demonstrate their superior moral standards through increasingly strict silence requirements. What began as expectations for relative quiet during labor evolved into demands for absolute silence that made effective medical care virtually impossible. Communities took pride in their women's ability to suffer without complaint, using these demonstrations of feminine virtue as evidence of their collective righteousness. The competitive aspect of silent suffering created hierarchies among women based on their demonstrated ability to endure pain without vocal response. Those who had successfully completed multiple silent births gained social status and authority over younger women, becoming unofficial teachers and enforcers of the silence requirements. This system prevented solidarity among women by making their shared suffering into a competition rather than a common challenge that might be addressed collectively. The most successful silent birth practitioners often became community celebrities, their stories retold and embellished over generations until they achieved almost mythical status. These legendary figures served as impossible standards against which all other women were measured, creating expectations that few could meet, and ensuring that most women would face punishment and shame for their natural human responses to extreme pain. The bureaucratic apparatus surrounding silence enforcement grew increasingly complex over time, with formal procedures for investigating violations, standardized penalty structures, and appeals processes that gave the illusion of fairness while maintaining the fundamental injustice of the system. Courts developed expertise in adjudicating cases involving vocal transgressions during labor, creating legal precedents that codified the criminalization of natural human responses to medical emergencies. These legal frameworks treated women's pain as inherently suspicious, requiring proof of adequate effort to maintain silence rather than assuming that vocal responses during childbirth were normal and appropriate. The burden of proof fell on the women themselves to demonstrate that they had tried sufficiently hard to suppress their natural reactions, creating an impossible standard that could never be objectively verified. The documentation of these proceedings reveals the elaborate mental gymnastics required to maintain the system's internal logic. Court records describe women's screams during labor as evidence of moral failure, their tears as signs of insufficient faith, and their requests for help as demonstrations of spiritual weakness. The natural human responses that should have evoked compassion and support were systematically reinterpreted as character flaws deserving punishment. As enforcement mechanisms became more sophisticated, they also became more cruel in their precision. Penalties were carefully calibrated to cause maximum psychological impact while maintaining the family's ability to function economically. The system needed its victims to survive their punishment so they could serve as ongoing examples to other women and continue bearing children whose births would provide future opportunities for demonstrating community virtue through silent suffering. The most devastating aspect of this entire system was how it convinced its victims that their abuse was actually care, their oppression was protection, and their suffering was salvation. Women were taught to be grateful for the social structures that brutalized them, to see their pain as purposeful, and to actively participate in perpetuating the same cruelties against the next generation. This psychological manipulation was so complete that many women never recognized they had been victimized. Instead, taking pride in their ability to endure what they had been taught was both inevitable and beneficial. The legacy of these practices extended far beyond the medieval period, creating cultural patterns and assumptions about women's pain that influenced medical care, legal protections, and social attitudes for centuries afterward. The normalization of ignoring women's expressions of distress during childbirth established precedents that affected how female suffering was understood and treated across all aspects of society, creating lasting damage that took generations to recognize and begin to address. The resistance to these practices, when it occurred, came not from organized movements but from individual acts of quiet rebellion, that were as dangerous as they were desperate. Some women found ways to subvert the system without directly challenging its authority, developing underground networks of support that operated beneath the surface of official surveillance. These networks were fragile and secretive, bound together by shared understanding of suffering rather than formal organization. Midwives occasionally found themselves at the center of these quiet rebellions, caught between their professional obligations and their human compassion. A few developed subtle techniques for providing comfort without openly violating silence requirements. They might position themselves to block observers' views while offering a reassuring touch, or time their interventions to coincide with moments when vocal responses might be briefly acceptable. These small acts of kindness required enormous courage, as discovery could mean professional ruin and social exile. Some women learned to redirect their vocal energy into physical responses that were less likely to draw punishment. They developed techniques for channeling their pain into controlled movements, rhythmic breathing patterns that didn't produce sound, or internal mental exercises that helped them endure without external expression. These methods were passed down through whispered conversations between mothers and daughters, creating an oral tradition of survival that operated parallel to the official culture of silent suffering. The most poignant acts of resistance came from women who found ways to support each other, despite the system's attempts to isolate them. They developed coded languages of touch and gesture that allowed communication during labor without violating silence requirements. A hand squeeze might convey encouragement, a particular positioning might offer physical relief, or a shared glance might provide emotional support that couldn't be expressed verbally. These underground support systems were necessarily limited in scope and effectiveness. They couldn't change the fundamental structures that demanded silent suffering, but they provided tiny islands of humanity within an ocean of institutionalized cruelty. The women who participated in these networks understood they were taking enormous risks, not just for themselves but for their families and communities. Yet they chose compassion over compliance whenever they could safely do so. The economic costs of this system extended far beyond the immediate fines and penalties imposed on individual families. Communities that enforced strict silence requirements often experienced higher rates of maternal and infant mortality, creating demographic pressures that affected long-term economic development. The loss of women and children represented not just human tragedy, but economic disruption that rippled through generations. The medical knowledge that was suppressed or lost due to silence requirements represented an incalculable cost to human development. Traditional healing practices that had been refined over centuries were abandoned when they conflicted with demands for quiet suffering. The accumulated wisdom of countless women's experiences was systematically erased, leaving future generations without access to knowledge that might have saved lives and reduced suffering. As we near the end of this dark journey through history, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that these practices weren't anomalies or aberrations from an otherwise enlightened past. They were logical extensions of belief systems that viewed women as inherently problematic, their pain as deserved, and their voices as disturbances to be silenced. The demand for quiet during childbirth was just one manifestation of broader attitudes that devalued female experience and prioritized social control over human welfare. The gradual decline of these practices came not from sudden enlightenment, but from slow changes in medical understanding, religious interpretation, and social attitudes that took centuries to develop. Even as formal requirements for silent birth began to fade, the underlying assumptions about women's pain and the acceptability of ignoring female suffering persisted in other forms. The medical establishment continued to dismiss women's accounts of their own pain well into the modern era, and social expectations for female stoicism remained powerful forces long after the specific practice of silent birth had been abandoned. The women who endured these ordeals left behind few direct accounts of their experiences, as their voices were systematically suppressed not just during labor but throughout their lives. The historical record is filled with the perspectives of those who enforced silence, the priests who justified it, the courts that punished violations, the communities that celebrated successful suppression of female suffering. The actual experiences of the women who lived through this nightmare remain largely hidden, recoverable only through careful reading between the lines of official documents and the occasional glimpse of truth that survived despite efforts to silence it. What we can say with certainty is that these women demonstrated extraordinary courage and resilience in the face of systematic brutality. They found ways to survive, to protect their children, and to maintain their humanity despite living in societies that denied their basic right to express pain and seek comfort during their most vulnerable moments. Their strength wasn't measured by their ability to suffer silently. It was demonstrated by their refusal to let that suffering completely destroy their capacity for love, hope, and connection with others. The legacy of their experiences serves as a powerful reminder that progress in human rights and medical care should never be taken for granted. The same attitudes that demanded silent birth, the belief that some people's pain matters less than others' comfort, that suffering builds character, that victims should be grateful for their abuse, continue to manifest in different forms throughout human societies. Recognizing these patterns in historical context helps us identify and resist similar dynamics in our own time. The story of silent birth ultimately reveals both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human resilience. It shows us how systems of oppression can become so normalized that their victims participate in their own abuse. But it also demonstrates the persistent human capacity to find ways to care for each other, even under the most brutal circumstances. The women who were forced to give birth in silence may have been denied their voices in the moment, but their stories, recovered and retold, now speak powerfully across the centuries, bearing witness to both suffering and survival, demanding that we remember and learn from their experiences. Their silence was imposed, but their legacy speaks volumes about the importance of listening to women's voices, respecting their experiences, and ensuring that the medical care and social support they receive during their most vulnerable moments reflects our highest values rather than our deepest prejudices. In remembering their forced silence, we commit ourselves to ensuring that no woman ever again faces such systematic denial of her basic humanity during the sacred and dangerous work of bringing new life into the world.